What does one do when the heavens fall silent? For the person of faith, this question is not merely theological, but deeply existential, probing the very foundation of their spiritual reality. We are taught to seek, to knock, to listen for a still, small voice. But what happens when our knocking is met with echoing quiet and our listening finds only a profound void? This experience, a silent season, can feel like a devastating betrayal, a spiritual winter where the warmth of divine presence recedes, leaving behind a chilling sense of abandonment and doubt. It is in this disorienting stillness that faith is most severely tested, forced to confront whether its foundation rests upon the tangible feeling of God's presence or the immutable truth of His character. The phenomenon of divine silence is a recurring motif within the Judeo-Christian spiritual tradition, often described by mystics like St. John of the Cross as the dark night of the soul. This is not a sign of divine punishment or abandonment, but a crucible for spiritual maturation. It is a period where God, in His wisdom, withdraws the sensory consolations of His presence to purify faith, detaching it from a reliance on emotional highs and spiritual consolations. The biblical narrative itself is replete with such seasons. Job suffered in incomprehensible silence, David lamented a hidden divine face throughout the Psalms, and even Jesus Christ on the cross cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. These accounts reveal that feeling distant from God is not an anomaly, but an integral, albeit painful part of a deep and authentic spiritual journey. The prophet Isaiah provides a powerful theological anchor for navigating these dark seasons. Who among you fears the Lord and obeys the word of His servant? Let the one who walks in the dark, who has no light, trust in the name of the Lord and rely on their God. Isaiah 50:10 NIV. This verse is a profound directive for faith in the absence of evidence. It does not promise immediate light or a restored feeling of connection. Instead, it shifts the believer's focus from their internal state, who has no light, to an external, unchanging reality, the name of the Lord. In this context, to trust in God's name is to trust in His revealed character, His covenant faithfulness, His sovereign goodness, and His unwavering love, even when all personal and emotional indicators suggest otherwise. The journey through a silent season involves several distinct spiritual movements. A. The initial phase is one of profound disorientation, where the believer recognizes a stark dissonance between their theological beliefs and their lived experience. Common manifestations include a sense of spiritual dryness where prayer feels like a monologue, Scripture appears lifeless, and doubt begins to erode long-held convictions. The individual may question their own faithfulness, wondering if some hidden sin has caused this divine withdrawal, or they may begin to question God's very nature, perceiving Him as distant, capricious, or uncaring. This stage is marked by a deep internal struggle to reconcile the God of past experience with the silent God of the present. B. Scripture serves not as a simple solution but as a companion in this wilderness, validating the experience of desolation. The raw laments of the psalmists, particularly in Psalms 13:22 and 42, provide a sanctified language for grief and protest, assuring the believer that bringing honest doubt and pain before God is an act of faith, not faithlessness. The narrative of Elijah in 1 Kings 19, who encounters God not in the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper, demonstrates that God's presence often manifests in ways that defy our dramatic expectations, particularly after periods of intense spiritual engagement. C. The critical turning point occurs when one shifts their perception of divine silence from an absence of God to a different mode of His presence. Secular logic and immature faith equate feeling with reality. If God cannot be felt, He must be gone. The profound theological truth, however, is that God's silence is not a punitive withdrawal but a pedagogical tool. It is an invitation to cultivate a faith that is not transactional, premised on receiving good feelings, but covenantal, rooted in the steadfast commitment to trust His character over our circumstances. Silence strips away the spiritual props we depend on, forcing us to rely on God alone, thereby purifying and deepening our trust in a way that constant consolation never could. D. The practical response to this season is not frantic striving, but faithful endurance. It involves the disciplined continuation of spiritual practices, prayer, scripture reading, and communal worship, not as a means to an end, but as an act of pure devotion and trust. This is a time to lean on the great cloud of witnesses, Hebrews chapters 12:1, drawing strength from the testimony of the church historic and the support of the local faith community. Furthermore, it is crucial to remember God's past faithfulness, both in one's personal history and in salvation history, using these memories as anchors of hope when the present feels devoid of divine activity. Ultimately, the most transformative truth to grasp in a silent season is this: God's silence is not the withdrawal of His presence, but rather the sovereign lowering of His voice so that we might learn to trust His character in the quiet. It is a divine invitation to move beyond a faith that merely listens for God's voice and into a deeper intimacy that can sense His very heartbeat in the stillness of unwavering trust. As the intensity of the struggle subsides into a quiet perseverance, the spiritual landscape begins to change. The silent season, once perceived as a barren wasteland, can be reframed as a holy wilderness, a sacred, albeit austere, space of formation. It is here, stripped of all else, that the soul learns its ultimate sufficiency is found not in spiritual gifts or emotional reassurances, but in the Giver Himself. This period is not an interruption to the spiritual journey. It is the journey itself, leading to a faith that is less fragile, more resilient, and profoundly more intimate with the God who remains steadfast even when He feels impossibly far away. Let the prayer of one in this season be not merely for the silence to end, but for the divine grace to inhabit it with unwavering faith and hope. Trust that the teacher is often silent during the test, and that the dawn is being prepared in the darkness. If this exploration of spiritual silence has resonated with your own journey, consider sharing it with another. For we are called to bear one another's burdens and remind each other that even in the quiet, we are never truly alone.